Coming up, as the offseason rolls on, another speculative trade rumor surfaces, possibly not as current as it may have been when initially discussed, but it still brings Doug and me back to the table. How much patience should Brooklyn practice, and how eager should other teams be to execute these trades for Kevin Durant? Coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. And over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFS for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on OGP, the One Giant podcast all off season. And Doug, we thank everybody for making their first listen. You lead us in, as I'll explain in a moment why I'm catching my breath.
How would you describe the move you just did on YouTube? I'm assuming that's going to get left into the final cut. What would you call the move that you just did? And if you're not listening on YouTube, if you're listening to the podcast, you need to go check it out on YouTube. So Adam's like now contractually obligated to leave this in. What exactly would you say you were doing before we led into the theme music? It looked like you were some kind of like, it looks like you were like emulating what a pet might do if it was like rolling onto its back and needing its belly scratched. It was highly unprofessional.
If you've ever seen a cat when you shine a laser pen across the room, boy, that thing starts getting really frantic. Doesn't know which way is up. That's essentially what happened after I needed to do about 23 seconds of athletic movement that caused me to almost have a convulsion.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
Look at me.
All right, so let's get into it. Yeah, let's get into this thing because overnight, if you have your Twitter alerts set up for the Woj and Shams tweets, and if
2:30 a.m. if you like it,
they dropped legit overnight, like 1:30, 12:30, 1:30 in the morning, something like that. Where as Adam mentioned at the top, there's a piece of news coming from both of the best reporters in terms of like getting information out there in Adrian Wojnarowski and Shams Charania, that the Celtics and the Nets at some point over this summer have been engaged in some kind of trade talks around Kevin Durant. And if you read the tenor of both articles, and I'm not going to sum it all up here, but Woj's was kind of gave you the sense that it wasn't all that close, right? Like that it was, and that might be the case. Shams did get into a little more detail where it was basically, they offered Jaylen Brown and Derek White and some picks for Kevin Durant, at which point the Nets said no. So there was, that got a little bit more into the, hey, we're using some specific names here to discuss, maybe what might be a baseline. Obviously didn't get done. Neither guy seems speculated or intimated that it was close now. It was more just it seemed like a well-timed leak, probably on the part of the Nets. Yep. To do whatever. But yeah, I think that's where it stands now, but it definitely gets people talking because unlike some of the other speculation around packages, this one's one of the first ones where it seems to be, hey, this is what was offered for Kevin Durant.
Yeah, and the idea that the Nets maybe came back and said, well, Marcus Smart, plus we want a rotational player added in there and maybe even more picks. And we know Boston has a few picks they could offer and then pick swaps as well as far as what potentially could be around. And to your point, everyone said, nothing's happening right now. Nothing's being talked about right now around this, but it is where the discussions went. And it's funny. Well, obviously starting on the Brooklyn side, I actually had a thought about the Boston side. And later on the back end of this episode, we are going to catch up with John Corrales to get the Boston Celtics perspective on it. And it'll be interesting for everyone to kind of touch base on that. We usually get good feedback. But from a Brooklyn Nets perspective, I think you said timely leak, seemingly maybe from the Brooklyn side. To me, it feels like let's get everybody back involved here. Jaylen Brown is a name. Who he is. You know what he's capable of. And you just saw him show up in the playoffs for Boston in a big way when the Celtics with Jason Tatum. So that there's this 1A or 2, combination with another superstar where you can start to get a real sense of not only is he still young at 25 years old, but he's also an established talent. And I think when we've been talking about the Toronto one's the one that always comes to mind when you say, oh, Toronto would never give up Scotty Barnes. I know he's a year into things, but this, I think, sets it up and says to other teams, hey, this is a real conversation with a team that offered this player in a package to let you know there is at least a baseline here, because seemingly up until this, it felt like, I don't know, everyone's walking away from the table saying there's no way you can touch our young talent in a trade for Kevin Durant.
Yeah, like you're right. It does seem like this sets something of a baseline of what we're going to say no to, like sending a signal out to everyone else is like, you would have to at least top this in terms of an offer. You would have to, Jaylen Brown, like you said, is a real name where he ranks. I mean, top 30 in the NBA ish, probably. Without looking too closely right now at that rankings, but like that's probably pretty fair for him. And, so you're saying what the Nets are basically saying with this is, yeah, you got to come close to this at least to start, or don't bother calling, right? Yeah. And that's like, might be a sign to like the Suns, like don't bother calling with Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson and some picks. That's not even close to what is being offered here or reportedly being offered from Boston.
And real quick there on the Phoenix one, that to your point, Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson, right, that's not Jaylen Brown. So there you go. Like you can already, take a look at that and say, not going to be good enough. And that's an important signal from Brooklyn.
Exactly. And so again, does this deal get done? Probably not. I can see why the Celtics would think about it. I mean, if you were at the doorstep last year with Tatum and, some of their pieces that they have around them with the coaching, getting Kevin Durant in the door would put them, even if they sent out Jaylen Brown and a couple other pieces here, would easily put them right at the top of contention for the I almost said national championship, for the championship. And so I totally get it from a Celtics point of view. And the Celtics make an interesting trade offer or trade partner too, because they're, unlike some of these other teams, they actually have a lot of contracts that can start lining up here. Starting with Brown, getting $26 million right away into a player gets you almost all the way there in terms of Kevin Durant. And then they have guys like Derek White, Marcus Smart, doesn't seem like they'd be willing to part with him, Robert Williams. They have some of these other like 10 million-ish guys. Smart's more than that, but they have these other guys in like the teens in terms of millions that help the contracts line up, and just talent wise too. So I do find it pretty interesting. And we could talk about whether or not we think those packages would be palatable, but yeah, in terms of resetting the market, this probably is mostly that, right? It's like, hey, other people, because Zach Lowe had mentioned on his podcast that basically every team had called. Every team had at least put in some kind of nominal call to the Nets to see what was going to get done. You'd be doing a bad job. You weren't doing your due diligence if you didn't at least call, right?
You can't have a team come out and say, we never called about Kevin Durant, when he ends up somewhere else and goes, I really hoped it called about me. It was the Houston Rockets, but
right, exactly.
Supposedly like, never made an offer.
Exactly. Right. Like you got to at least do your diligence there. So yeah, no, but framing it from that perspective does help, I think, fans. It helps the league. It helps other teams. Fans are least important here, but it helps everyone sort of understand what the baseline expectation. And by the way, thank you, because I'm so glad this actually happened, because thank you for the Celtics on this, because at least it resets the conversation around some other people coming out with this like ridiculous Phoenix package, which never made sense, to say, hey, welcome to the real world. This is what the actual packages need to look like to get it done. Please do not posit any more of these completely ridiculous things when you're trying to get a top, at worst, 5 player in the whole NBA onto your team. It's just not going to work. You can't offer these other things. So maybe stop bothering. And I think from that perspective, I'm thankful from a content piece. Thank you. Thank you for resetting it, because I was kind of getting tired of trying to defend these ridiculous packages.
And it's funny too, because coming up in a second, I'm going to bring up the team who actually beat the Boston Celtics in the finals, and the Golden State Warriors, and around player personnel and packages that go into this. And then philosophically, how Boston and Golden State and teams like that could be thinking about a Kevin Durant. But I will also say this also, I think, kind of does it sets the floor in a much different way than Phoenix saying you want Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson. But I think it also can start to restructure, and maybe why you're hearing this on the Sean Marks Brooklyn Nets side of saying, remember that Rudy Gobert trade, which we don't know, that it never made official, that the Brooklyn Nets were saying, we want 30 picks from a team that wants Kevin Durant. But in the landscape where everyone was saying, if Rudy Gobert equals that, then it needs to be astronomical for Kevin Durant. This can also be saying, hey, for the right quality players, it need not be a collection of talent that keeps the Brooklyn Nets competitive and then puts that team in a position to still have success with Kevin Durant. So I think we kind of maybe are shrinking the window of what a acceptable trade market should look like for Kevin Durant, age, talent, all things being factored in. That I want to dive into that a little bit deeper here from a what teams now then, if that's the new window, should be looking at Kevin Durant from Brooklyn.
And I want to talk to also just real quick about like whether we find this palatable too. Like, would this
Yeah.
be something that the Nets would think about saying yes to? And I think I have some strong thoughts on this one. I think I'll get to that in a second. First, I'm going to talk to you about our friends over at Built Bar. 4 words for you here: coconut brownie chunk puff. That is all you need to know about what Built Bar is sending at you. That move that Adam did at the top of the podcast, he's about to do it again here, because when he hears those words put together, you know it's absolutely delicious and absolutely good for you, because that's what Built Bar has been able to marry together. They've been able to marry the flavor plus the stats that back up you staying healthy, low calorie, low sugar, high protein, all super delicious. Whether it's the protein bars that Built Bar gives you, whether it's the puffs, 100% covered in chocolate, great for on the go during the summer if you're trying to keep yourself, well fed and then make sure you're staying healthy. Good for the kids. If you're taking some beach time out, throw them in the bag. Everyone's covered for the day. Flavors for every single person in your family that's going to want these, because they've got the flavors covered. All Built Bars made with the collagen protein. Their body absorbs really efficiently. It's got tons of health benefits. All you have to do, you go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off of your order. Go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com.
Why would anyone double down by doing that visual gesture again? We don't know for sure. Enjoy that on YouTube, though, friends. Before we get philosophical, then, on this specific package, what do you find? Don't say yay or nay yet on it, but what do you find attractive about Derek White, Jaylen Brown, maybe another role, a Grant Williams, and then some picks? Why is that attractive to Brooklyn from your perspective, if it is?
Yeah, I think it's getting close, right? It's not a 1-for-1. Jaylen Brown is a really nice player. He's not Kevin Durant. He probably is never going to be anywhere close to Kevin Durant. So you're not getting a super duper star back.
Not a number one player.
That's not going to happen in any trade, though. And if Kevin Durant wants out, that's not going to happen in any trade. This probably represents the best player I've heard mentioned realistically in a trade package so far. We've speculated on guys like Barnes, and we talked about, Ayton before that kind of came off the table. And we talked to Brandon Ingram's been thrown around, though there's never been any real fire with that smoke. So this is the best name that's come out yet, right? And Jaylen Brown, 25 years old. We saw him make a deep playoff run. Is inconsistent at times. He definitely has holes in his game. He probably doesn't top out to be higher than the top 15 player in the NBA. But if you package that with a bunch of picks, and if they were able to get something like all the way to Marcus Smart, now you're talking about a team that's at least competitive for next season, right? Because remember, the Nets have to be, it's imperative that the Nets are competitive going into next season. And they would be with a team like that, like built around that. They would not a championship level team for sure, but no version where they send Kevin Durant out, are they going to be a championship team? So I think that part, I don't really need to stay married to. But in terms of young talent, you maybe will be able to re-sign him because he's up for contracts up after next year, right? You might have the inside track to re-sign him for the next contract. You'd be able to stay competitive. You can sell that player probably to a fan base in terms of just some tickets and stuff. There's a lot of boxes that this checks that have not really been checked with some the other things. So while short of just giving what the exact package is, this one at least represents something, I think, getting close. Now, whether they want to, you're going to throw in Robert Williams, you're going to throw in Marcus Smart, they probably have to throw in another real guy. Derek White doesn't really represent that kind of real guy for me. And I'm sure it didn't to the Nets either, because they said no. But I think if the Celtics can remember that they're getting Kevin Durant back, and now it's Jason Tatum, Kevin Durant, and whoever they have left, Horford, whatever one of the guys doesn't go sent along, that's still a championship level team, even if you sent out another guy. So I think this is getting pretty close. And I see why they said no, but I could talk myself into it in a world where it's all going to go bad. I'm still team run it back, but this one gets close.
Yeah, and I think too, it's interesting about what players you're talking about inside these packages. The Derek White piece. Do I like a Derek White? Sure, but if you told me, because you mentioned Robert Williams there, at the back end of your and it's well, maybe I ought to have the Jaylen Brown. Maybe I'd rather have Williams, and I'd like Marcus Smart. But what are the iterations of this package that give me the best chance to your point, be successful in the short term? Now, we've talked about before about how this upcoming season doesn't need to be a full-blown ultra competitive version for the Nets with the way some of the picks lay out and stuff. They could have a pseudo punt year. What I find fascinating about some of these potential packages is that you end up putting together potentially, especially if it does include a Derek White, a very sound defensive core that you put on the field for Brooklyn. And then what you start to dream on is, well, now Cam Thomas, not a defensive player, all of a sudden you get to be a pure scorer for this roster, right? Now, if you go into a draft class over the next couple of years, and assuming you bring back a Jaylen Brown, you also get to say, now we can look for a specific player that complements this core that we want to keep intact for at least a handful of seasons. So I think that that's what's really attractive about Boston, because again, all of these names that are being brought up are established talents. You know what they are in terms of a commodity, whereas not necessarily with Ingram, he's clearly established, but Scotty Barnes, as we've talked about. So I find that interesting. The thing philosophically that I think is worth mentioning here too is that a team like Boston, the question that I think they're asking themselves is, did we overshoot with Ime Doku in his first year? Did we overshoot the mark in his first season? And getting to the finals was great, but do we feel comfortable as currently constituted? And they also added in a couple of minor moves here in the background in the offseason to say, hey, we got better at the positions of need. Let's go right back into it. Understanding Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are young. You have to ask the question, do we kick open the championship door, even though it may be smaller, that much wider than saying, let's stand pat and be ultra competitive, but maybe never get across that mountaintop as we may hope to? What is Jason Tatum at his absolute peak of his powers? Will he be on the same level in his prime as Kevin Durant over the course of his career or over these next couple of years? If you don't think that Tatum can do that for you and be the leader, and in some ways Jaylen Brown had to take over for that team when Tatum struggled, then adding in a Kevin Durant makes all the sense in the world. But you have this push and pull. It's why when we talked about Golden State briefly, that was a really easy one for me to say, why does Golden State need to throw all of their young talent and all of this value, knowing that they can win championships? They still have their experienced veterans, and they already have the kind of this path of success for themselves, right? So I think you need a team that feels a little bit desperate in some regards. The question becomes, does Boston feel desperate to want to go get this championship potentially in the next 2 years versus staying the course and knowing you may not get back to the next 2 years, right? Next 2-3 years, you may not get back to, and then Jaylen Brown is a free agent. And did you already miss the window trying to rebuild now again, just around Tatum?
Yeah, I think it makes total sense for Boston to want to do this. I think if you look at the landscape of what they need to go up against, they didn't have it easy this year, but a lot went right for them this year.
Dysfunctional Brooklyn Nets team. They
right. Like the Nets were a mess. The Bucks didn't have Middleton, right? And then they gave Golden State their best shot and kind of weren't that close, right? They lost in 6. And they'd be running the exact team back in an East that theoretically is arguably more competitive next year. Like there's a chance that Philly's better. They made some really good moves. Cleveland will just be better. Chicago will just be healthier. These aren't championship teams, but they're all better. Maybe you want to say Atlanta's better here. Even if the Bucks are just healthy, right? Remember, they just didn't have their third best player who was super critical in that series. Probably would have swung the series just having Middleton. So I think you can actually, as the Celtics, and just really easily look at it and say, this is a really good team, but it might just not be good enough. Now, if you have a top 5 best player in basketball, then it will be good enough, and we can ship out other guys. I don't even think it's desperate. I think it's just correct. I think it's correct to think this way because remember, they're a year,
and I mean desperate to capitalize on the opportunity.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I know you weren't they're not. Desperation would signal like a bad move in a vacuum. Like this wouldn't be a bad move for them. And by the way, real quick, honestly, like you said, can Tatum hit Durant's peak? No, and I only say that because very few people historically have ever hit Durant's peak. Like he's a top 10 player of all time. And this is no shade on Jason Tatum. Like, it's just really hard to get there.
And how much better does he become when you put Kevin Durant on the floor?
Exactly. And you just need these kind of guys to win the championship. So if you're of a championship mindset, which I think every team should be, if you have the requisite pieces, then you should be thinking about making this move. And if it costs you sending out a 50-cent piece and a quarter and and some other stuff to get it, then you should really think about it, because you don't get that many bites of the apple. And it can be easy to think, hey, we got there last year. We'll just grow on this linear progression where we're going to be, X better next year. So we'll have a chance. That's just not how it works. And now you're 1 year away from having to sign Jaylen to big money, right? So why not take Tatum and try to do it now? I kind of see it. So yeah, I would be on board with this. I haven't checked in too much with what Celtics fans, I'm sure they hate it, but just because that's just how fans usually roll with this stuff. But I think from the Boston Celtics standpoint, it's correct. And then obviously the other problem too is like, does Kevin Durant want to go to Boston? This
Coming up here in a second, obviously, I want to talk about the Brooklyn Nets and why the patience piece that we've talked about so much can be a push and pull for them, and what this could signal not just for other teams coming to get Kevin Durant, but about Boston as well. So before we dive in, just quickly, I said John Krause is coming up. That'll be a bonus piece. You can catch a 10-minute interview with him talking about the Celtics side of it in that perspective. Find it over on the YouTube timeline and enjoy that conversation for sure. But there's more meat on this bone from our perspective. First with Brooklyn. When we talk about, we said the Nets can be patient. Kevin Durant is under contract. I think the only reason why, and we anticipated this cycle will drum back up as the offseason moves along. One of the reasons why they might be inspired to try to get this done is, and you've mentioned this before, showing goodwill with the players, right? Kevin Durant's requested a trade. You want to keep that good reputation with players around the league and free agents, etc. So it behooves you to not acquiesce, but accommodate if possible. And then the other factor is, if you go into the regular season and you say, well, he's under contract, maybe teams will get desperate at the deadline. Maybe we just want to see if we can convince Kevin Durant to stay here. You know, if you're in a holding pattern over trade packages, what if Kevin Durant gets hurt? You know, what if something doesn't go right to start the year and all of a sudden teams are going, yeah, we'll give you a little something. Now, Kevin has been hurt the past 3 seasons. So, and all of a sudden that package starts to go on a sliding scale. I think there is a organizational value in saying, Kevin asked for a trade. We found a good package that works for us and gets him to a destination that he likes. And we're going to go ahead and pull the trigger so we can continue to move on in our offseason, which would also then include revisiting Kyrie Irving and what ultimately his future is.
Yeah, they're in a weird spot right now. I talked about this on the podcast yesterday, so I won't go back through it. But if you didn't listen, it was basically about how this trade demand by Durant has done a lot of things, but it's also just screwed their ability to make their roster into something anything close to competitive right now. Excuse me, not competitive, complete, because they have to leave spots open because they're almost definitely taking more than one player on in a Kevin Durant trade. And then if you're already at 15, you'll have to cut someone and you're going to take a cap hit, you know, a la what happened with James Johnson last year. Remember, like where they end up having to pay him essentially just to not have him be on the team just because they took in someone extra at the trade deadline. So, with Dragic. And so at the buyout market. And so like they're just in that spot now. So they're already hamstrung in terms of how they're going into the season because they can't make any more moves. Like they can't do anything. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that like just the way that this is flowing there, even though I'm all for this happening, if they get to the regular season, they have to be, like you said, they have to be sure that Kevin Durant's going to be coming back and wanting to play for the team going forward. Like they're not going to, Durant wouldn't play. He would probably sit out and they will play probably a game of chicken around that if it gets all the way to that point. Those are like that plus what I mentioned to Jackson Gatlin about Ben Simmons, which is like, there's some world where they don't love Ben Simmons here because we haven't heard a single guy say a nice thing about Ben Simmons yet from anyone really on the team. Look, that can mean nothing, but sometimes, like I said yesterday, what you don't say is as loud as what you say. And so I think for those actually to me are the strongest cases for why they just need to get this done and why they end up they'll never be able to accept this package that they just mentioned with the Shams piece because they were already on record as saying no to it. And it'll probably look really weak to say no and then say yes. But it wouldn't shock me now for like something like this to get done for the reasons that you mentioned and the ones I just said. Like they're in such a precarious position right now that unless short of full buy-in from KD, you are at risk of being really, really bad off come opening night.
And so the other side of this, and I agree with you, is that's why as every day turns, a new layer to this story kind of unfolds. But the other side of it I want to mention specifically when it comes to Boston, and maybe why there is some wiggle room in terms of other assets, is it is Brown. Like Jaylen Brown, go back to the beginning of this past season before Ime Udoka adjusted and implemented a new style. Like they were going the wrong way as an organization. And there was those conversations. Can these guys, Tatum and Brown, play well together? Is the right ideal combination of these two stars? So now that these rumors come out, also value from the Brooklyn Nets side to say, hey, heard you guys threw Jaylen Brown into a trade package. It does two things. As there was the Twitter shaking my head from Jaylen Brown when this bubbled up. But it can work in Boston's favor in the sense of, just like we're saying from the Nets side, hey, NBA, we are putting Jaylen Brown on the table for trade offers. Other teams can now get involved here and go to Boston and say it need not be this seismic shift and giving up a ton of assets, but maybe there's a player swap there. Some people have even talked about the Donovan Mitchell angle of it all. So all of these things are occurring in the background here around this trade package.
Can I say one thing real quick? Because you made a great point that I just want to make sure just didn't get skipped over here. That great point by you, which I had just forgotten because they played so well. We are less than a season away from people questioning about whether the Jays could play together. So I just want to make sure that everyone heard what Adam said here, because it doesn't take much sometimes to shift the narrative. And they clearly did that by making the championship. But that was not built out of nothing either, right? Like there was a reason that that was spoken of about a possibility. And that was not a made up storyline. That was a real thought among NBA circles of whether or not they would trade him, even at last year's trade deadline, in terms of, bolstering the squad. So anyway, I just want to make sure that was such a good point that I want to make sure it wasn't like just skipped over, because I think it is easy because I had forgotten it too, frankly. It is easy for everyone to forget that we're not too far removed from that narrative.
And that's why the question becomes about, does Boston think they overachieved this past year in getting to the finals, or that under Ime Udoka, okay, maybe we're just scratching the surface of what this core can be for this team going forward? That's the fascinating question. I'll get out of here on this, though. We mentioned about, does it bring other teams back to the table? Do you think that I don't care about Phoenix, because I know you talked with Brendan Clean the other day. Like, I don't care. Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson, like, it means nothing. And I know, and I love Brendan, but when he said, go find me a better package, I just found one. Like, oops, one just fell in my lap. It involves Jaylen Brown. So it looks like you guys have a problem in Phoenix. Like, I do not like what that offer would look like from them. But say Toronto, does this, that untouchable piece, does all of a sudden you go, well, if we want to be in this and we can't push come to pull, we can all of a sudden look at one that says, oh, we give up a Scotty Barnes and a Trent Jr. and we get to keep OG and Siakam and add Kevin Durant and then go into the picks, obviously, and Kem Birch, etc. Like, all of a sudden that baseline looks a little different, where maybe giving up what you think is one of your best assets is a little bit more palatable, because it's not this laundry list of 3 or 4 of your 5 starters plus all these other assets.
It just depends where you think you are in the championship timeline. To acquire Kevin Durant now, you have to believe that you can win the championship with this move. That's how I feel. That's at least how I would be looking at it.
Yes,
because
conference finals and strong that you can win and go to the NBA finals.
You have to be because you're going to sell so much that you have to believe that that's going to be the case, right? I think Boston can easily tell themselves that story. Phoenix clearly can. They just might not have the goods. Toronto feels like the more precarious of that group around whether they actually believe it to be the case. Like, is Fred VanVleet, Pascal Siakam, and Kevin Durant as your core enough to win the championship? It's probably pretty darn close, if not a yes, right? But they're like, of those 3 teams, they seem like the less like a lock to feel that you could really tell yourself the story. And so that's really what it comes down to too. And this is why the short of, forget about Kevin Durant's own wants about where he wants to go. This is also why the list of teams is shorter too, because you can't really acquire him unless you think that this is going to put you over the championship hump, because you're just not going to have a long enough window on Durant. It's going to cost you too much in assets. You're going to be mortgaging the future for sure for a chance to win now, which you should almost always do if you're close. But if you're not close, it can really, really screw you up for a long time. So I think that's where I land on where Toronto is. So I'm sure we're gonna be talking about more about this week. Like, this stuff tends to come in waves. Even by the time we're done recording, something can come out. But just when you think the NBA offseason is going to take a step back for you, it's like, nope. Got a little overnight tweet. The Boston Celtics are in this thing. So let's see how this goes. Let's see how this little, trial balloon lands in terms of when we let it out. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. You get to see the ridiculous thing that Adam did at the beginning of the podcast with that weird cat stretch that he did. So you can go check that out. And the rest of the episode, obviously, you can watch as well. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, free and available on all platforms.
I'm planning on joining a gym near my house, okay? Mindy Kaling from The Office.
One of the all-time great poets, Kelly Kapoor. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.